BBC Radio 4, it's 9:05 and time for The Moral Maze. Here's Michael Buerk.
Good morning. I wonder if anyone will ever be christened Lolita again. Vladimir Nabokov's eponymous 50s novel about the 12-year-old girl seduced by her stepfather, Humbert, has become the paradigm of paedophilia. It's been recast in plays and on films, either to stigmatise or to exculpate these forbidden desires, to portray a vile exploitation of innocence or to explain it away, the child consciously or unconsciously as participant rather than victim. The latest film, starring Jeremy Irons, is more the latter than the former, according to its critics. The acceptable face of child molesting, said the Daily Mail. The film that tells perverts what they want to hear. The campaign to stop it being shown seems to have succeeded in the United States, where it's having difficulty finding a distributor. Pathé is apparently willing to distribute it here, and it's just got an 18 certificate. Jeremy Irons says he'll leave the country if it doesn't get shown, so the stakes are high. Actually, they are. A balance has to be struck between freedom and risk. Freedom of expression, in this case, against the risk of encouraging, being seen to justify child abuse. It's a decision for real life, too. A convicted paedophile is about to be released who is considered to be so dangerous to children that 30 police officers are being assigned to watch him round the clock. According to the papers, there are half a dozen others, still considered predatory and violent, who'll be released in the coming months without supervision. The NSPCC wants all child sex offenders kept locked up until they pose no further risk. Again, freedom, these men have served their sentences after all, against risk. Our Moral Maze, live this morning. Our panel, Janet Daley of The Telegraph, the constitutional historian, Dr. David Starkey, Dr. David Cook, the medical ethicist from Oxford, and Michael Mansfield QC. Janet Daley.
Well, this dilemma is a good example of the paucity of the political rights culture. There is simply no way of reconciling the rights of adults to free expression or, for that matter, the rights of convicted paedophiles against the rights of children to safety. When the rights of different groups conflict with one another, we have to appeal to some higher principle. Our responsibility to care for and protect children is absolute, whatever civic philosophy we subscribe to. That isn't morally negotiable, I don't think. We can have debates about free speech or about artistic taste, but those are matters for adult priorities. Children may or may not be put in danger by certain kinds of adult expression, but we can't abdicate the authority for making judgments about this. We can't just pit the interests of children into a contest about who has the best claim to a sacred right.
David Starkey.
I think, in fact, Michael, in this programme, and indeed in your introduction, there are two very separate questions. The film, finally, is a work of fiction. It's a second-tier work of fiction. It's a film of a book. I am very loath ever to draw direct consequences from fiction to action. But the second question, we're looking at the actual treatment of paedophiles and child abuse. That is obviously about the real, horribly real world. But I have a fear here, too. We have fashionable crime. A few years ago, the fashionable crime also linked to child abuse was satanic abuse. Fashionable psychiatrists and social workers all trooped in to proclaim the reality of satanic abuse on an enormous scale. It is now clear that staggering injustice was done as a result of that. I fear that the present labelling of child abuse as a uniquely horrible crime before which we should bend or sweep aside all our notions of civil liberties and rights is profoundly dangerous.
David Cook.
As I understand this film, it portrays paedophilia in a sympathetic light. And it does that by trying to picture a child who's at worst predatory and at best consenting. Both are wrong. Neither can ever be an excuse or a justification. Paedophilia is not a fashionable crime. It's never acceptable. And people ought not to be free to abuse. But I don't think it's a choice between freedom and risk. It's really a choice between freedom and the certainty that some paedophiles will reoffend. The freedom that we really want to defend is freedom for our children, the freedom to be free from fear, from abuse, the freedom to be children.
Michael Mansfield.
Well, can I take the second question first? The freedom to abuse. And as I've mentioned on the programme once before, I've got 6 children, some of them are grown up now, but nevertheless I'm very concerned about this. And if you begin to broaden the debate, you see how the idea that paedophiles are a particular race that have to be locked up in a particular way, never to be released, and when they are released to have the spotlight of publicity upon them, is in fact, I think, a situation in which we're getting things totally out of context. Are we then going to say that every person convicted of robbery is going to achieve the same kind of status. Everybody convicted of murder achieves the same kind of status. No. We have to be approaching a situation in which we go towards an accommodation, a rehabilitation, and an understanding. And so far as art is concerned, my only concern with art is if the object of the artistic expression is to provoke and to promote the desecration and the denigration of individuals. If it isn't intended to promote that, as far as I'm concerned, it should be expressed.
Panel, thanks very much indeed. Our first witness is Christopher Tukey, who's the Daily Mail film critic who...
Daily Fail.
What a good thing.
No, I used to work for it myself, so no, absolutely not.
But you escaped, Michael, you escaped.
I escaped, all right. Anyway, in the Daily Mail, you describe this current Lolita as one of the most malodorous turkeys of all time. If that's and you then proceeded to tell us in considerable detail why it shouldn't be shown. If that's so, though, if it's such a malodorous turkey, how is it likely to deprave anybody?
Oh, because I don't think artistic merit has any bearing whatsoever on a film's ability to deprave and corrupt. I mean, some of the seediest pieces of pornography are found in paedophiles' houses and flats when they're raided, and that has nothing to do with how good or bad they are.
Yeah, so it isn't ineffective then in that particular context. Is that what you're saying?
Well, I mean, Adrian Lyne is quite a skilled filmmaker, and it's quite. I think he set out originally to make quite a very, very soft-core, erotic movie about a forbidden love affair. In gearing it towards Jeremy Irons, I think he's made a sort of cardinal error in trying to make Humbert Humbert a much more sympathetic figure than he is in the book. He's completely missed the deep black irony in Nabokov's original novel, in which Humbert Humbert portrays himself as one thing, but we can see quite clearly from his actions and from little hints that are brought out about his past life, his internment in lunatic asylums, his voyeuristic practices, that he isn't as he would like to paint himself. Adrian Lyne has totally missed all of that, unaccountably, and instead he's given us a sympathetic study of child sex abuse from the paedophile's point of view. It's an extraordinary thing to have done, but he's faithfully reproduced the way that paedophiles love to see themselves as misunderstood victims of children who have appetites which only they can satisfy.
But the paper actually says this is a film which tells perverts what they want to hear. And in what way is that risky, and what way, briefly, is that dangerous?
Well, I think that why do we impair freedom of expression? For two reasons, I think. One is to prevent harm to others, and I think particularly to protect children. And secondly, I think to register social standards of behaviour, to register disapproval, to say that certain things are beyond the pale. And I think Lolita really falls short in both these areas.
Michael Mansfield, your witness.
Well, the first point I'd like to make is that the approach one has to art shouldn't be limited to films, should it? I mean, we have to be looking at all artistic material. Do you agree?
Yeah.
You do. Now,
though films are not the same as other art forms. Well, I'm not saying that.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying expression in those forms have to be looked at in the broadest sense, given the criteria, which is the prevention of harm to others, that you've proposed. Mm-hmm. You agree?
Yes.
Right.
One of the criteria.
One of the criteria, and social standards.
Yes.
Now, I want to deal with a well-known play, Medea, which has as its central thrust and central story a sympathetic account of a mother who kills her children. Would you ban that?
Of course not. If I wanted to ban everything that portrayed antisocial behaviour, then of course we would be banning hundreds of films a year.
Exactly.
There are other criteria that come into play.
And of course there's paintings, Hieronymus Bosch, for example, who showed people being skinned alive and tortured. You wouldn't ban them?
No, I wouldn't ban Nabokov's 1955 novel either.
Right, so the real line of distinction is it's not the original book, it's the fact that the interpretation of the book here is a sympathetic portrayal as opposed to the way it was originally put. Is that your demarcation?
I think that's part of it, yes.
In other words, if it had stuck to the original book, you wouldn't have any complaint, even if it was performed badly.
I think it would be very difficult to do so ironic a book in such a way that it would be incapable of misinterpretation.
I don't want to interrupt you for a moment, Michael, but do you discern then an unhealthy motivation, purpose behind this?
I had certain fears from the fact that Adrian Lyne, his previous track record, which was of soft porn like 9.5 Weeks, and of Mario Casal, the producer, who had made Basic Instinct, suggested that these were, to some extent at least, exploitative filmmakers. They would probably say pushing back the bounds of popular taste. But I think I would regard them as fairly cheap and exploitative filmmakers on the whole.
But I mean, exploitation, of course, one abhors. But do you ban exploitation if it falls short of promoting a particular activity? In other words, I've made the distinction at the beginning that unless it promotes that activity, for example, the hatred of black people or the hatred of children, unless it promotes that, then really you can't stop it.
Well, where I differ from you, see, is that I think your attention to the word intention is wrong here, because I don't think it's the intention that's that important. I think it's the effect that is important.
Well, the effect of many, that's why I go back to Medea and all the rest of it. Some people would say that many works of art have an effect which is actually rather gross.
But the effect of seeing Medea is not to make you want to cut up your children, for goodness
No,
sake.
no, but it may make you understand. What it may do is, it may lead the public into believing that it is forgivable that such a thing should happen, and therefore promotes an agenda. It could be said. I'm not saying that.
Well, I certainly wouldn't.
David Starkey?
I confess, completely at a loss in the criteria by which you're criticising the film. You seem to now to be saying that it's all to do with the effect that it has, or the possible effect.
I think, no, it's not just about that. I think it's also... I'm saying it's also about laying down certain social standards of acceptable behaviour. The fact is that, we impair freedom of expression on this programme in such a way that I do not make sexual advances to anybody here. I do not use foul language. I do not use foul language. We all have certain conventions that we obey, and I think part of what we give certain levels of certification to should reflect those social standards. When we're talking about banning Lolita, incidentally, let's make it clear, we're not talking about burning the film, we're not talking about imprisoning Adrian Lyne, we're not talking about sending Jeremy Irons out of the country. We're saying, should it be given an 18 certificate?
So when you say that this is an issue of child protection, you're not saying that the film is likely to lead a paedophile to go out and offend, or are you?
I think it would certainly reassure a paedophile that this is how children regard paedophile men, that it's a very sympathetic portrayal of a paedophile, but it's also saying that certain young women really are gagging for it.
Mr. Tukey, you use the expression, doubtless out of your profound knowledge of paedophiles, of I think this would do something to a paedophile. You're also rather keen on banning another film, Crash. As far as I'm aware, motorways have not been cluttered with copulating corpses following the release of that film, have they?
No, indeed, and I never said they would be, although I am reported as having said that in The Guardian and The Observer and Time Out from time to time, but no, I never said that.
So you wanted to ban that film on grounds of your divine right to social disapproval as well, did you?
No, I didn't say that, no.
So on what grounds did you wish to ban it?
Because it showed and eroticised non-consensual sexual violence, mutilation and killing. Is that a good enough reason for you?
It would eliminate Shakespeare, the Bible, and the whole of the classical canon.
If you think that anything in Shakespeare eroticised non-consensual sexual violence, it's absolute baloney.
Two things, just to wrap up. I'm still not quite clear, because you're not... you're reasonably libertarian in other areas apart from Crash and this film. Exactly what it is about this, whether it's outside
what you regard, be quiet, David,
acceptable social.
Not at all. I can assure you, I've stood out against my editor on Kissed and Pulp Fiction's name. But
whether it's outside acceptable social standards, or whether it's likely to deprave and encourage paedophiles to commit crime.
Well, I think I oppose them on those two levels. On the whole, I am a libertarian. You're right. I can't think of any other films which I would like to see banned or not given an 18 certificate. On the whole, I would like to see more freedom of expression. A wider diversity of viewpoint in British films would be very nice, for example.
OK, Christopher Tukey, thank you very much indeed. Our next witness is Andreas Whittam-Smith, who's Britain's new film censor, of course, and will have his name on the 18 certificate on the front of Lolita when it gets shown. What do you think? I'm interested here. What do you think is the crucial test here, and for what reason do you think it passed that test?
Well, I think that the crucial test will vary from film to film, and this is probably, I hope, an unusual one to have to judge, because it's been very, very difficult to arrive at a conclusion because the board's been extremely aware of people's concern about what seems to be the widespread incidence of paedophilia, which has come as a surprise. So the crucial question was, is this film itself likely to generate, encourage, validate paedophile behaviour? That's, I think, that's the crux question.
And on balance,
which is very, of course, very difficult to answer. So the first stage of arriving at a classification decision is a very important stage, which is that the professional examiners of the board look at it and examine it very carefully, and there are about 15 of them. And their job is doing this, and they become good at it, and they're a very high standard. Then the second stage is with such an important question, is to take advice, specialist advice. So we consulted 2 psychiatrists who specialise in this field, and I sat with them as they saw the film. And I tried, as I've said elsewhere, I tried politely to bully them into saying that they thought that this film would generate paedophile behaviour which might not otherwise have occurred. And they wouldn't say that. They didn't think so. I couldn't get them to say that.
And so on this basis, with the advice of all these other people...
But I think it has to be... I think my job is to be more than that. I don't think my job is simply to add up the votes.
No.
You know, and to say, well, all you thought this, and you thought this, ergo, this is the answer.
Yeah.
I think my responsibility is to listen to all the advice and then try to make my own contribution, which I can only describe as just try to make a common sense conclusion and to retain something which I bring to the job, which is a certain freshness. I'm not a professional, I'm not a film buff, although I love going to the cinema, to bring a certain freshness and a certain experience of other fields.
Janet Daley, your witness.
You used 2 different words. You said that the crucial question was, would this film generate or validate paedophile behaviour? Now, the generate is a causal question. You know, would this cause people to imitate this kind of behaviour? And that you imply is, when in your later comments you implied that was the critical question for you. Validate is a rather different subjective sort of judgment,
I think it's
isn't it?
a spectrum here, because the same question arises when you're looking at a compelling portrayal of violence or something, or rape scene for that matter. There's validation, which may make people who have a disposition towards something may think, oh, this is okay. Or there's something rather stronger, which is that people who perhaps have a disposition but haven't fully recognised it within themselves think, and somehow it enters their consciousness somewhere, and when some circumstances arises which we can't forecast now, it clicks into place. So I use those words as indicating that we're on a spectrum here. But I don't think that this film takes us down the spectrum, and I think the best way of seeing that, which sort of struck me with a thunderbolt when I reread the novel, is to remember that opening line, Lolita, fire of my loins, my sin, my soul. And so from the very start, you get this intertwined all the way through. So it's a study, you all know it well, but it's a study of a destructive obsession, and that's clearly marked in the book. And I think it's clearly marked in the film.
I was going to say, is it clearly marked in the film?
Well, yes, this is the most important. This is what we...
The thing that a book has, that a film doesn't, is a narrative voice, the internal voice of the character, which can be very heavily ironic, which can give you a commentary on the action. Whereas if you see action in and of itself, especially to the impressionable, action on the screen looks like a species of reality. Whereas action in a book exists only in the mind's eye of the reader. There is a difference, isn't there? There
is a difference, but it's a difference between 2 languages. It's a difference between the language on the page and the language on the screen.
Right.
And they're both languages, and they both have different ways of registering a range of attitudes and emotions.
Forgive me, if we were conducting a postgraduate seminar on the nature of the linguistic study of the novel.
Well, I wouldn't like to go too far into that area.
No, exactly. That would be the kind of comment that we would all find very interesting. But when we're talking about impressionable people going to see films who would probably never read the book, we're talking about creating what seems to be a reality, and we're talking about generating. You were talking about generating imitative behaviour. Christopher Tukey said, he thought this was a sympathetic portrayal of child abuse from a paedophile's point of view. If that were true, would that be sufficient moral objection to the film to not distribute it?
There's no question, and this is the main difference between the film and the book, I think, is that by raising the age of Lolita from 12-ish to 14-ish, she's become, in this fictional world, more mature, and as she becomes more mature, then automatically the Humbert character will always appear more sympathetic. So in trying to answer the sort of secondary way of looking at the main question which I posed, which is, does the film sufficiently strongly mark the doomed and destructive nature of the relationship? Does it sufficiently strongly mark it, as it certainly does in the book? We had to bear in mind that by raising the age of Lolita, that's almost made the task of the filmmakers harder.
Making a girl 2 years older isn't an issue. I mean, why then do you think
it is
that
an
they
issue
used a
because
19-year-old
puberty
body?
very quickly.
Why did they use a 19-year-old body double rather than just going ahead with a 14-year-old?
Because of the law, which means that you can't show children under the age of 16 in any situation could be called sexually compromising, and that's to protect the actress.
And isn't it the
actor,
case
whatever.
that young people need to be protected? Before 14, they need to be protected.
Yes, I'm not going to have an argument about the exact age because the age of consent is 16, and that's a fact we must deal with. So, I mean, I'm not going to argue that at all. All I'm going to say is that the act of raising the age, bringing Lolita closer to womanhood, automatically makes the Humbert character seem more sympathetic.
So it was all wrong for 12, but it was all right
No, I'm
for
not
14.
saying that. No, please don't. I mean, listen
No, he said the
carefully to what
opposite,
I'm
in
saying.
fact.
I'm just saying it has that impact, and that was something we had to reckon with. It made our task harder, if you like.
Right, but your job is to classify films.
Mm-hmm.
And you recognise there is a need for classification.
I think yes, I do. I think that
So the public need to be protected.
there are a number of ways of stating what our task is, but the most important one for me is to say that we're in business to help parents regulate the viewing of their children.
So in the end, you believe that lines need to be drawn.
That's the job I'm in. That's the job I'm engaged in. At the
So
same
we're
time,
disagreeing about
so
then
the
is
same-
where the line should be drawn.
Hang on a second. The same time that we gave Lolita a certificate for the cinema, and the cinema is different from the video market, by the way, we at the same time refused to classify 3 videos. So of course we're trying to draw a line.
And if Lolita had been a video, would you have refused to classify that?
I would have to think very hard about Lolita in video form, but I haven't formed a view about that yet.
Could I just ask you this question about changing the age of Lolita to 14 and using a 19-year-old body double? I mean, they could have used a younger body double and still be within your constraints. Does that not smack to you of a way of making paedophilia, because the whole idea of Lolita is of a very underage child, more acceptable and therefore more justified?
No, I don't think so. I just think that it made the effect this change had on us as examiners and classifiers was to make us to want even more strongly the reminder throughout the film, using the language of filmmaking, that this was a destructive, doomed, wrong relationship.
I understand. David Starkey, quick question.
It won't be all that quick, but Mr. Whittam-Smith, you've been giving a wonderfully smooth justification for censorship. Exactly the same grounds are once used for censoring books, were used for censoring the stage, and the grounds is very simple, isn't it? That it's popular. Therefore, superior people like you and Janet and David should tell the vulgar populace what they should watch. Isn't that right?
Well, I'm going to check this shortly. I certainly believe that parents, all the anecdotal evidence I have, and having been a parent myself, does one ever stop being a parent, but my children are well over this age,
David.
is that parents want this. But very shortly, we are going to go around the country and conduct meetings. We're going to visit housing estates, and we're going to try to find out quite directly by confronting people, by showing them what we do and asking them to comment. And if I get a deafening answer which says, stop interfering in our viewing, stop interfering.
So you
It's going
support
to the
hanging,
cinema.
do you?
I don't, as a matter of fact,
But the
support
popular
hanging.
verdict on hanging is quite clear.
Thank you, David. Janet, you were bursting.
Yeah,
but a
no,
very
I just,
quick one, if you wouldn't
all
mind,
right.
because we're running
It
out of
seems to
time.
me that you're still talking about influencing the behaviour of people who watch films. Well, could you ever grant that a film could be degrading and immoral in itself, not necessarily because of the effect that
I
it
can
has on viewers?
envisage such a thing, yes.
Yes, and would you find that reason for refusing to give it a certificate, a licence?
I only hesitate for one reason, which does very much depend upon it. It's very hard. I mean, I can imagine that such a thing might confront us, but I haven't seen such a thing yet.
Andrew Whittam-Smith, thank you very much indeed. Our next witness is Oliver James, the clinical psychologist. In a newspaper article you wrote, you described paedophilia as the most hideous crime committed by the most terrifying individuals in society. You didn't pull your punches there, did you?
Yes, I mean, I think paedophilia, I would want to distinguish between pubescent and prepubescent children, although the moral problem is still there, and the legal problem is still there. Most paedophiles are regressed paedophiles of a kind people who've hit a problem in their life, got depressed or something, and often start having sex with their children or with small children around them. And of course, those are the ones who are attracted to pubescents are the ones who are potentially the ones who could be influenced by Lolita. The fixated paedophiles are the ones that I'm writing about in the article there, who are a huge problem because they are devious, they're cunning, they're the ones we know about who get through as many as 300 little boys in their whole career, and most of them probably should be locked up for life.
So, can we draw a distinction between fiction and fact here? I mean, to what extent is Lolita liable to encourage or validate the behaviour of paedophiles of either kind?
Well, of course, I haven't seen the film, so crucially,
none of us has.
None of us have. But that is rather important.
Yes, of course.
Because the aesthetic question is very important. Is it a powerful aesthetic film that manages to draw you into this and think, that might be fun? Because obviously, the problem with sex with children is, all children have a sexuality. 2/3 of adults in 1950, when Kinsey did his survey, could remember having had sexual play when they were children, and the same is true today. Likewise, there's nothing peculiar about men of quite old ages being very attracted to nubility. There are huge surveys that show that worldwide nubility is what men prize in the physical appearance of women. Now, the thing that is where the problem starts is obviously that men actually who are paedophiles, who are of the regressed kind, the kind who start having sex with their teenage daughter. Now, that is, if there is a problem, that's where it is. They might feel that this film was giving them permission. And certainly, I do believe that although not one single crime of any kind has been directly caused by somebody seeing a film or a TV program, I do think it's true that since 1950, the deluge of corrosive violence and sex on television has overall given permission to people to commit more violent crime.
David Starkey.
Can we go back to the point that Michael began with you? You stated, as far as I can see, that it is the most hideous crime, there's no qualification, committed by the most terrifying individuals in our society. These paedophiles are worse than Frank and Rosemary West, are they?
Well, they effectively, yes, because the damage they cause is quite phenomenal. If you've ever worked with the victim of...
Let him finish. No, David, be quiet, let him finish.
If you've ever worked with... I made, actually, a TV programme about it, a chap who deliberately married a woman when her daughters were something like 8 and 10, because he saw their potential for when they became teenagers. Now, those daughters, from what I could gather, might as well have been dead. They suffered so much. And it is a form of tyranny. It's a form of damage to the integrity of the self that is very difficult to describe unless you've actually done therapy with somebody who's been the object of this. It's terribly destructive to your identity.
So it's worse than murder.
It's a form of psychological death, yeah.
It's a form of psychological death. Okay, let's accept that I suppose, in the language of psychology, we believe that kind of thing. Can we then look at how these people should be treated? You also say in this article that we must change the law to ensure that all convicted paedophiles are given open-ended sentences, even if this means that people are kept locked up for life after committing relatively trivial offences.
Yes, what I actually said was that fixated preferential...
I've actually read what you said. I'd like a comment.
Is that a
on
direct quote?
It is a direct...
Okay,
presumably you ghosted the piece, therefore you're not too familiar with the text.
No, on the contrary, I write a column every week in The Independent and write my own column. No, actually, whatever I said in the bit that you've actually quoted, the point I'm trying to make is that fixated paedophiles, everybody accepts, are extremely difficult to change. Regressed ones, yes, there is hope. With fixated ones, they just go on and on and on, and they're extremely devious. And I'm afraid, I mean, God knows, I don't want to pay for it out of my tax, but I'm afraid that it may well be that the only thing you can do is bang them up.
Who determines whether, after this relatively trivial offence, this person is a fixated paedophile to be kept in eternal incarceration?
Well, I mean, the trivial offence may be at the end of a long line of other rather less trivial
No, they're
offences.
convicted for this offence.
Yeah, they may be convicted for a trivial offence, but it may be very well established that they have committed many other offences.
Sorry, that's an objective test. I'm asking who determines whether this person is a fixated paedophile. Somebody like you.
Somebody like me, yeah.
And therefore we replace you as an expert for the whole of the judicial process. I'd be very interested to know what Michael Mansfield felt about that.
Indeed, Michael Mansfield, your witness.
Just about to come in on this.
If David would allow you to, which he graciously has.
Yes. I want to broaden this, because we're not here really in a sentencing debate or disposal debate. I mean, from one point of view, I think you'd accept that repetitious violence, whether it's upon blacks, women, old people, pensioners, whatever, is reprehensible in the extreme.
Yeah.
And that in terms of dealing with that, there are going to be a multitude of different ways, and really you can't approach any of it, on the basis that people remained locked up for the rest of their lives, as a premise.
Quite.
Right. Now, I want to get away from that, therefore, and deal with the artistic situation as to whether you would draw a line in this way. That, do you feel that as long as the piece of art, and by which I mean painting, book, or anything else, does not actually promote, and is not intended to promote, the violence I've just talked about...
Is this a question? No.
Yes, it is. The question is, now in the artistic field, provided it doesn't promote that, surely it's permissible.
Yeah, I agree.
Right. Now, what's the problem with Lolita, then?
That's called a ridiculous mouse.
Of course, I haven't seen Lolita yet, but I have seen the Kubrick version, and I've read the book. Neither of those do I believe should be banned. The fact that there is a large age difference, and that's where the whole problem comes, of course, between a man and a young pubescent girl, that's where the problem is. But the fact that it's represented artistically in a book, so long as, with all the obvious caveats,
Well, then, can I move it into, because you talked about since the 1950s that there's been a corrosion through the artistic world in terms of violence. Now, can you just define it? Is it just that the picture depicts it, Pulp Fiction, for example, or what? What's the criteria?
Well, I'm not trying to generalise this out to censor every film since 1950, but I'm saying that all I can report as a psychologist is that I am reasonably convinced by the evidence, and by having looked at all the other causes of violence since 1950, that one of the contributory factors giving people permission to use violence as a way of expressing frustration and anger is the huge amount of violence shown on television and in films.
The central question posed in all this is trying to balance freedoms, either artistic freedom or actual freedom for convicted paedophiles against the risk they pose. What I hear from you is that we underestimate the risk of at least a portion of paedophiles, that this risk is very, very large.
It's not a risk,
great.
it's certainty.
I think that, I wouldn't want to exaggerate. I think that if you legitimise, if Line's film, unlike Kubrick's film, actually seems to legitimise what's going on, then there is a problem. Because if I was a father who was having a lot of trouble not getting any sex from my wife and lusting after, as many fathers do, lust after their teenage daughters, the key thing is what gives you permission to step over that line, because it's extremely common for people to have that lust. It's not common for people to go over the line.
Oliver James, thank you very much indeed. Our next witness is David Niven, who's Director of Action on Child Exploitation. Mr. Niven, do you see, he's on the line from Bristol, do you see a connection between the artistic freedom of a filmmaker in making a film about paedophilia and, if you like, the civil freedoms of paedophiles who've actually paid for their crimes?
Well, I mean, there is a connection in the sense that I haven't seen Lolita either, so I'm afraid I can't comment on that particular film. But earlier, Andreas Whittam-Smith talked about intellectual validation, and that's been our experience. If that film does contain effective representation of paedophile activity, then it will become currency within the paedophile community. I've been aware of situations, for example, where in prisons, prisoners convicted of sex crimes against children actually have a very extensive currency market in the defence briefs of their trials. They get passed around because they get a charge out of this. It reinforces it. And if they see in the commercial market a film representing paedophilia, effectively they will be validated. They will feel, well, if society can pass this and actually accept this as part of the integral kind of entertainment market, then essentially what we are doing is less bad. So I think from that point of view, we've got that's the thing I would be most worried about.
Do you think the people who decide whether these things should be shown take this on board sufficiently? I mean, you heard Andreas Whittam-Smith saying that that this was one of the considerations, that, you know, there were two psychiatrists who we tried to bully into saying things of this kind and they didn't. Are you reassured by that?
Well, actually, I am a little bit, but I mean, I haven't seen the film, so I have to bow off and making comment. But
I understand.
Could I talk about the actual issue of paedophiles themselves and release into the community, an issue of civil liberties, because that's been mentioned quite a bit.
Indeed.
I am fully in favour of the civil liberties of the children, and I think that's something that people overlook, because when you do, as you introduced the programme, talk about two conflicting issues clashing, I mean, my view is, well, there are far, far more children at risk out there than there are the smaller community of paedophiles who pose the risk to them. And I think the balance of civil liberties has been tipped against children, and this is what we've got to redress, so that when we look upon civil liberties, I think you've got to talk about, and that's things like confining people with indeterminate sentencing. I would suggest a tribunal system such as the mental health world has, with people who know what they're talking about, regularly reviewing people's progress towards rehabilitation or treatment or whatever. But when you get unreconstructed paedophiles who have shown no remorse, I think there should be a case for saying they shouldn't be allowed out into society.
But isn't the problem
David
that
Cook?
we end up in situations where people have been in prison, they've served their sentence, they've done their time, and they've paid their penalty as far as society is concerned. So shouldn't they be free in a way that everybody is free?
I think this is where we come to the issue of what is civil liberties, because essentially in the absence of a written constitution in this country, I think you could say, for example, it used to be considered a civil liberty in this country to own slaves. Life moves on. It used to be considered a civil liberty in this country to beat your wife. Life moves on. What I'm saying is I think we're at one of these life moves on
It's never a civil liberty to own slaves. You're wrong. You should read English law. Mansfield declared that a slave who steps foot on the soil of England is automatically free.
But let's not get bound up in
I was
slavery.
talking about Englishmen abroad.
I was talking about Englishmen at home.
Either
and
way, we're
Scots
getting
too.
sidetracked.
Can we be clear whether or not, in terms of civil liberties, we think that we should or should not set limits to people who have already served the sentence, which was what they were assigned?
Well, I mean, again, I think here's where it's going to be useful to have a lay opinion of paedophilia, because the psychopathology of paedophilia still engages great debate, as I understand it, whether it's nature against nurture and so forth. What I think is the nearest condition that we can put on paedophilia is an addiction. And the difference here is that it's an addiction in which the actual victim is not the person themselves. And society has therefore got a wider responsibility to put certain controls and measures in place.
And are there therefore some paedophiles who will not be treatable, will not be rehabilitated, will continue to be a risk?
I believe that the evidence has shown that.
Janet Daley?
You persistently described this as a question of civil liberties. You said the balance of civil liberties had been tipped against children, as if it were a contest between two camps, children on the one side, paedophiles on the other. Can I put it to you that this is just a completely inappropriate vocabulary, that we have an absolute moral responsibility to children? There's nothing reciprocal about it. They don't have any duties to correspond to their civil rights. We have a duty to protect them that is absolute.
Well, I would agree, but essentially I'm trying to find situations here, you see, that are workable. And at the moment what we're getting in the media, not on this programme, I think that's fair, but we're getting scare stories, and everybody is becoming increasingly scared and anxious. And what people are not coming up with is workable solutions.
Yes, but forgive me, don't you think that by putting this entirely in the language of civil liberties and human rights, you're putting children at an enormous and permanent disadvantage? They are not equal parties to this fight.
Well, I hope not, because that wasn't my intention. I mean, what I do wish to see is a much greater atmosphere of protection for children. And effectively, when you get situations like only 5% of children who've been sexually abused ever getting their case in front of a criminal court, and so that the 95% have to be dealt with, treated, helped, protected in various other different places where the perpetrators don't actually get recognised, but the children, the victims, get registered, then I think that's an issue we've got to consider.
Michael Mansfield?
Yes, I want to avoid the sentencing debate of whether we lock people up for life because they're unreconstructed, whether they're paedophiles or anything else. I want to broaden it beyond that to the question of the contribution of art towards this situation. I mean, I'm not clear. Are you saying that some forms of artistic expression are contributing to this? And if so, what's the criteria you use to make that assessment?
I would have to take it case by case, because I think we've accepted the fact that there are laws, there are regulations, and there are conventions at the moment that actually determine the fact that there is no such thing as total artistic freedom. It's a matter of degree, and all we're arguing about is the degrees. And so it would have to be a case by case basis.
David Starkey, your last question.
And Mr. Niven, you began by telling us that certain of these paedophiles are so intrinsically wicked that they get turned on by defence briefs, which is not items of legal underwear, but actually the legal document. Are you proposing banning these as well?
Well, I'm just giving an illustration of any issue where addicts actually get stimulated and provoked.
But that would remove... wouldn't that remove all use of children in advertising?
Not at all. I mean, for example...
But they may get turned on by that. You can't argue from the effect, can you?
Well, I think it's a matter of degree, you see. For example, it's a bit like saying, see that boy, that older boy selling heroin by the school gates over there. Well, leave him alone, because if we actually arrest him and stop him doing that, they'll only go round the corner and buy softer drugs. I think that's a spurious
argument. It's as sensible as your remark on slavery.
David Starkey, thank you very much. David Niven, thank you very much. Our last witness is Dr. Mona Siddiqui, who's a lecturer in Arabic and Islamic Studies at the University of Glasgow. Dr. Siddiqui, from that particular perspective, where do you draw the line on things like films and books and so on between the freedom of artistic expression and the risks that expression might pose to societies and individuals within society?
I think in the first instance, what we should try and look at is reevaluate exactly what we mean by freedom, and recognise that freedoms they may be a very superior principle, but they come with a conscience and a consciousness that what is being produced for public consumption should not be produced for public corruption. I don't think that any work of art, whether it's a film or literature or paintings, etc., exist in a vacuum. All art exists in a social context, and therefore there is a bilateral responsibility between the creator and the public.
That's well as a broad principle, but presumably somebody then has to introduce practicalities in all this. Can you give us some idea of what you think is acceptable or not? You probably haven't seen this film. We certainly haven't,
no,
so it's very difficult.
It.
But you know basically what the novel is about. You know, you get some idea of of its treatment. Can you draw some perhaps general principle from this specific example?
Within the what I've read and heard about the film, I think it would be, my own perspective would be definitely that if the ultimate intention of the ultimate effect is distasteful or potentially morally corrupting, then there should be censorship on it.
Janet Daley.
You make no distinction between distasteful and immoral.
No, there is a distinction, but I think because people are varied in what their perspective of morality is, they try and get around this by using different words, and a lot of people
So you think that distasteful and immoral are just different words for the same thing?
But they can overlap. I don't think they're the same words for the same thing, but they do overlap. And people sometimes, when they don't want to particularly make a certain point about something, they will say something distasteful when they really actually do mean it's morally reprehensible.
Yes, but do you understand them to be different things? I mean, things that are distasteful to one group of people might be perfectly acceptable to another. I mean, for example, in many people who subscribe to your own faith would find the depiction of any sort of nudity, a Botticelli or a Rubens, to be objectionable. That doesn't, do you think that anything that anyone finds distasteful should be morally questionable as well?
No, but I mean, since you made the point about people who are part of my own faith or belong to my own faith, from a religious perspective, you are bowing down or creating a vision of society based on divine revelation, basically. Within the Islamic perspective, this divine revelation culminates in a text, and that text, whether it's the Quran, in this case obviously the Quran, it gives you an ethical framework within which to work. And most Muslims will be very forward and will be very vocal in saying what they think is morally reprehensible. They will not mix words. But I try to look at Muslims living in a society that has multiple perspectives on what is distasteful, what is morally correct, what is good behaviour, what is decent behaviour.
Dan, you're in danger of giving just too much away here, because in the end, all right, we live in a pluralist society, but on all religions, quite clear, there are some things which are absolutely wrong, and molesting children, paedophilia, is always wrong. Do you disagree with that?
I agree entirely, but from the discussion we've had, that obviously doesn't seem to be the consensus.
Well, I don't think we've had anybody around the table who suggested that paedophilia was a proper thing.
But no, if you're going to say paedophilia is wrong, then you should also be adamant in saying how do we actually curb this, and not instigating and not propagating or perpetuating certain freedoms that allow for this kind of image to be portrayed.
But isn't that exactly the point here, that they're talking about restraining both the depiction of paedophilia in a positive light and the restricting the freedom of people who have been found guilty of paedophilia in order to protect individuals in society?
Well, I think there should be restriction on what can be expressed, definitely, because as I say, we do not live in, artists do not live in a vacuum. They are responsible to society, and they're responsible to the masses that they're trying to appeal to. But somebody has to, and in this case, obviously, in the world of cinema, there is a censorship board.
Dr. Siddiqui, David Starkey speaking. Can I just ask you a very simple question? What is the age of legitimate sexual intercourse for a female in Muslim law?
Well, there is no one Muslim law, I'm afraid.
But in the Sharia, it's 12, isn't it? Marriages are legitimate.
Marriages are legitimate in... It depends what you mean by the Sharia. It isn't as simple as that.
But it is
There is a classical law, and there are modern interpretations of the Sharia.
But the classical law, it's 12, isn't it?
It is 12, yes.
It is 12, exactly the same age as this girl. So providing this had been called a marriage, it would be okay to a Muslim.
There's a world of difference
between
between
the two are completely different things. I would want to see anybody who would regard marriage as just sexual exploitation.
With a 12-year-old?
It depends on the age of the partner. And remember also that Sharia law was written not in the 20th century, was compiled in the 7th, 8th century, where the social fabric of society was entirely different.
Mona Siddiqui, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Panel, I thought the distinction that was initially made by Andreas Whittam-Smith, our new film censor, a distinction between whether the film, we're talking about artistic freedom now, might generate paedophilic behaviour or validate paedophilic paedophilic behaviour was an interesting one. What did you make of that, Jenny?
Yes, I thought it was interesting, but what struck me was that he then went on to talk almost entirely about generating, because he seemed to feel, a great many people feel, that that's easier to judge, that the criteria for whether it generates are much easier than the very subjective and value-laden criteria for what validates an activity. And I don't think, in fact, that it's very easy to prove at all whether an artwork would generate certain kinds of imitative behaviour. I think that's a red herring anyway. But whether it validates one seems to me to be a completely subjective and difficult judgment.
But important?
Oh, of course.
I think that the validation principle is in fact quite close to the principle I was trying to outline at the beginning, namely, it may be a very difficult exercise to try and delineate what the intention of somebody was, but the validation exercise is much the same. But I would draw the line that provided it isn't provoking and promoting that kind of material, then there should be a freedom to express. And I think what worries me a bit about sort of focus groups around the country, which Andreas Whittam-Smith is now going to engage in, is that he will be subjecting the whole process of film watching to a public all saying, we don't like this or we don't like that. And we're back into taste again. And I'm very concerned that we're not about taste, we're about ensuring that people have a freedom to exist. And anything that promotes that should be done.
Yeah, and I'm afraid you can't make value judgments, you can't make moral judgments by popular consensus. You can't have a referendum to say whether it's right or wrong to do something.
David?
Well, indeed you can't, but then why do the experts to whom we've been entrusting people's morals, we've been entrusting people's liberties, we've been entrusting people's psychological health, how do they determine it either? As I was trying to say to Whittam-Smith, exactly the same arguments that he used were used to justify the censorship of books, were used to justify the censorship of the stage. It is frankly condescending nonsense. I also think that we've got to address another question, the argument about effect and response. It is perfectly clear, and it was said with the most magnificent absurdity by Mr. Niven, when lawyers' briefs can actually stimulate paedophiles. Anything can stimulate somebody, almost from a pair of shoes upwards or downwards.
But do you...
If we banned... We began with talking about risk and freedom. If we banned everything that could produce an ill effect, life would stop tomorrow. In fact, it would stop now.
But do you accept that there are vulnerable people?
Yes, but I don't accept that
and there's a duty that they should be protected in some way.
I do not accept that the prime purpose of the law is to protect the vulnerable all the time. It seems to me that this is an area in which the extent of what has been actually described as an addiction is so strong that anything can be bent to the purposes of those who are addicted. Nobody has demonstrated a sensible argument why Lolita should be banned. Therefore, the balance must be overwhelmingly towards freedom.
David Cook, you draw a line against that, I imagine.
Well, I do, and it's interesting that there was agreement that this kind of portrayal, this particular portrayal, does in fact seek to validate paedophilia. What disturbed me, though, was that if we go to fall in the hands of the experts, it's not clear. Some experts seem to be saying there is harm, others say there is no harm. I'm not sure. We go back to common sense. Common sense is that if
always right and always the same.
Well, common sense does show that there are some fundamental things which are wrong, and abusing children is always wrong.
The last word with you, Janet. Shut up,
There's a
David.
distinction between, a very important distinction between art forms. Nabokov himself said, it was perfectly all right for me to imagine a 12-year-old Lolita. She only existed in my head. But to make a real 12-year-old girl play such a part would be sinful and immoral, and I will never consent to it. That is a very important distinction.
That's it. That's it for this week and for this series, and indeed for the moral maze at this time of day. From our panel, Janet Daley, David Starkey, David Cook and Michael Mansfield. And from me until the next series on Wednesday evenings and repeat on Saturday evenings starting on May the 13th. Write it in your diary. Join us then. For the time being, though, goodbye.
The Moral Maze was presented by Michael Buerk and produced by David Coomes. The series researcher was Lisa Davis.